Hi, folks. Let's get back to this conversation on population and how population growth actually ties into the concept of power. Um, uh, these ideas of power structures and how these structures of power can either allow for the distribution of food to large populations or prevent the distribution of food to large populations. Um, an important concept here is that countries with power, uh, first world countries, countries from the West, countries from the East, countries like the United States, China, France, Britain, they all have a greater ability to gain food that they require because of their power, because of their position. Whereas poorer countries and poorer people have little control, few options for gaining access to the social goods, whether that's food or property or jobs and benefits, and ultimately they regard the production of children as an economic resource, which of course is one of the reasons why we see large rates of population growth in poorer countries. Francis Moore Lape argues little correlation between population density, amount of cropland, and hunger, alluding once again to this idea of power and how power impacts the distribution of food, especially in relationship to population growth. We know that poverty and environmental decline lead to population growth by decreasing power people have over their lives. And as this power decreases in their ability to control their own lives, they're going to have more children to create a sense of long-term security, much like we've seen in the past through the creation of large families. Amartya Sen, who we talked about, or who we will talk about in chapter 6 when we talk about justice and the ideas of John Rawls, talks about the politics of famine. And Amartya Sen draws our attention to the causes of famine, which is the lack of access to food. Sen points out that societies have entitlements to food and other goods and social systems. As these systems break down, famine occurs. The solution to this, of course, is the redistribution of access to food and guaranteeing an entitlement to food via farms, jobs, and democracy. So as the old ways of doing things break down, conditions of impoverishment and extreme conditions of impoverishment being famine, those are predictable. And a solution to that is doing things differently and redistributing the access to food. We could talk about this in relationship to the redistribution of wealth in countries, as the wealth distribution is skewed in an extreme way to the wealthy, and the systems that have held up that system of inequality, as they start to break down, an initial solution to that breakdown is the redistribution of wealth as well. There are some limits of the inequality perspective. First, we need to account for spatial distribution of environmental productivity as a source of social power. We also need to think about the fact that production does matter. Not all areas have equal production capabilities. Some places are going to be more suited for farms. Some places are going to be more suited for natural resource extraction, and some places are going to be more suited for urban development. And then, of course, marginal systems of production and entitlement are a deadly combination. Chapter also draws us to the cornucopian argument. Julian Simon puts out this theoretical perspective. The solution to resource scarcity was to increase population. In this theoretical perspective, people are the ultimate resource. More people equals more brain power and labor work to work out technological solutions to scarcity. There is a caution to this. It does not consider social inequality. If life is improving, we have to ask ourselves, who is life improving for? And technological innovativeness depends on social circumstances to encourage creative thinking. And I also, discourage us from structuring social systems this way just because we have the manpower and the thought power to attack the problem. It does not mean that we are going to solve the problem through a technological fix. A good example of this is global warming. Everyone knows that the climate is changing. And there are certain solutions, or at least paths forward in addressing climate change. But thinking that humans are going to come up with this quick fix to climate change, quick technological fix to climate change, simply because in the past we've come up with technological fixes to other of our social ills, it leaves the potential for us to fail. We might solve it, but we shouldn't rely on this as a strategy to move forward. We also have the Boserup effect. Esther Boserup, she's talking about population pressure as a primary factor for stimulating adoption of more productive farming practices. The process qualifications, technological change is not the same as innovation. Issues of inequality can limit influence, and conditions of rapid population growth may limit economic development. And of course, unintended environmental consequences of technological change must be considered. We can think about this Boserup effect in relationship to water resources in the state of Colorado. When the first settlers came out here, they realized that they weren't going to be able to survive based on their dryland farming strategies that they brought with them from the east. And so the first technological fix to scarcity in Union colonies' inability to plant fields and get water to raise crops was a system of ditches. And what that system of ditches did was it allowed for Union Colony, in a small way, to survive in an arid to semi-arid environment, or in other words, a desert. This led to a slowly but turning into rapid population growth, which ultimately limited economic development. We once again came up with a technological fix and created reservoirs, and we continued to run up to our carrying capacity of the environment and continued to come up with technological fixes. These technological fixes often had unintended environmental consequences, like endangered species, the changing of ecosystems, and the overall reliance on a water source that is scarce, and if under certain circumstances could create some serious hardship for large populations that rely on this water delivery based on the technological fixes that we've put in place over time. There's also demographic critiques of Malthusianism, this idea of a demographic transition theory, where you have high and fluctuating crude death rates and high and stable crude birth rates, which lead to low and stable crude death and crude birth rates. This is closely related to modernization theory, and as modernization theory falls to the wayside, we can also expect demographic transition theory to do something similar. As we might guess, modernization theory didn't work all that well for less developed countries, and neither does demographic transition theory. The rate of population growth is much higher in these areas. Poverty that leads to children to be viewed as a labor supply may be intractable as well. There are more critics that doubt desirability of Western-style development than we give credit for, and the levels of inefficiencies and consumption in European demographic transition may not be sustainable over time. Women in development, this is a huge piece of the development and underdevelopment issues. Women certainly play a key role in demographic transition, especially in less developed nations. Improved status for women viewed as is viewed as the most significant means of reducing rapid population growth, improving lives of their families, and especially of poor children. And the status of women is the most consistent factor in fertility reduction. We know that if we educate women, they're less likely to have more children, and they're more likely to be financially successful. We also see the feminization of labor in this idea of development, the idea that women often enter the labor force in low-pay factory work, and ultimately are still being marginalized, which we want them less marginalized. And we need to address the elimination of patriarchal relationships throughout the developing world. And finally, family planning and birth control. The promotion of birth control is controversial in many of these countries, but controlling birth rates is going to make women's positions much better in developing countries. Poor promotions of birth control are viewed as oppressive, racist, and patriarchal, and birth control can influence population trends when linked with social equality. So what is the solution? The solution is education. If we educate women, they're less likely to have as many children, and they're more likely to be able to control birth rates and control population growth.